Okay, think about this. Something like 1 in 5 Australians living today might actually have a convict ancestor.
Yeah, it's an amazing statistic, isn't it? It really connects the present day right back to that whole era of forced migration.
Absolutely. So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really getting into the story of Australia's convicts. We've got some great historical sources.
We're looking at things like Australia as a penal colony, convicts in Australia, and a really interesting document on the convict sites themselves.
Right. And the aim here is to, get past the usual myths a bit, understand what it was really like, the complexities, the individual experiences, and how it all shaped Australia.
Definitely. There's a lot to unpack.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. Why transportation in the first place?
Well, it's kind of a perfect storm, historically speaking. Britain loses its American colonies, right? So suddenly, where do they send their convicts?
Good point. They needed somewhere new.
Exactly. And then Captain Cook maps the east coast of Australia. So there's this vast land, and Britain's thinking, okay, opportunity, but also we need to get in there before the French do.
Ah, the geopolitical angle right from the start.
Absolutely. It was definitely a factor.
Which leads us to the First Fleet, 11 ships, setting off in 1787.
Yep, arriving in Botany Bay, January 88. And you have to picture it over 700 convicts crammed onto 6 of those ships. Plus all the Marines, the officials.
An incredible undertaking. But Botany Bay, it wasn't quite right, was it?
No, not ideal at all. Governor Phillip saw that pretty quickly. The bay was too exposed, the ground was marshy, not great for settlement.
So they moved.
They did. Explored a bit north, found Port Jackson, much better harbor, and they established Sydney Cove on January 26, 1788.
Which is now Australia Day.
That's the one, the real beginning of the permanent European settlement. And it wasn't just Sydney, of course. Other penal colonies popped up later.
Like Tasmania.
Van Diemen's Land, yeah, starting 1803. Then Queensland in 1824. And much later, Western Australia started taking convicts from 1850.
But not everywhere took convicts.
Right. South Australia and Victoria were set up as free colonies, officially anyway, though some ex-convicts did end up moving there later on.
So this whole system, it really ramps up, doesn't it? Especially around the 1830s.
Oh, massively. That was the peak period. The sheer numbers involved are just staggering when you think about it.
How many are we talking, roughly?
Overall, between 1788 and 1868, it's estimated around 162,000 convicts were transported to Australia.
162,000. Wow.
Yeah, huge numbers. It eventually slowed down, of course. Opposition grew, both in the colonies and back in Britain. The last ship arrived in Western Australia in 1868.
Now, when we think convict life, we usually picture extreme hardship. And the sources back that up, right? The First Fleet nearly starving.
Oh, definitely. The early days were incredibly precarious. They didn't have the right farming knowledge for the environment. Supplies were short. It was touch and go. High mortality rates.
And the journey itself must have been brutal.
Unimaginably so. And life in those early settlements was incredibly tough. But, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Go on.
While the suffering was absolutely real for so many, transportation, weirdly, sometimes ended up being a path to a better life for some.
A better life? How?
Yeah.
They were prisoners.
I know, it sounds strange, but think about Britain at the time, very rigid class structure. If you were poor, your chances were limited. In Australia, once a convict served their time, they became an emancipist.
Right.
And because the colony desperately needed people to farm, build, set up businesses, there were actually opportunities. Land grants, for example, things that would have been almost impossible back home.
So social mobility was actually possible.
To a degree, yes. It wasn't easy, obviously, but for some, it offered a chance they'd never have had in Britain. It's a real paradox.
But it wasn't all potential opportunity. There were the really notorious places, the secondary punishment sites, like Port Arthur.
Exactly. If you misbehaved in the colony, you could be sent somewhere even worse. Port Arthur in Tasmania, Norfolk Island. These places had fearsome reputations. Solitary confinement, really harsh regimes, pure punishment, and deterrence.
Okay, so that sounds more like what you'd expect.
But even then, there were systems like the ticket of leave. If you behaved well, you could get a sort of parole, work for yourself before your sentence was fully up.
And eventually, freedom.
Eventually, a certificate of freedom, yeah. So it was this complex mix of extreme harshness and potential incentives.
Still, even if you got your freedom, there must have been a stigma attached, being an ex-convict.
Oh, absolutely. For a long time, having convict ancestry was something people didn't talk about. There was a sense of shame, the cultural cringe, some people called it.
But that's changed now, hasn't it?
Massively. Over the 20th century, attitudes shifted. Now, finding a convict in your family tree is often a source of, fascination, even pride. It's part of the Australian story.
It really shows how perspectives on history change. So who actually were these people? What crimes landed them on those ships?
Well, the overwhelming majority, maybe 80%, were transported for theft, often quite petty theft, stealing food, clothing, small items.
80%? That's huge. Not murderers and violent criminals, then.
Some were transported for more serious crimes later on, but Britain had the death penalty for many of those offenses anyway, so relatively fewer were transported for things like murder or rape compared to theft.
Interesting. And it wasn't just men, was it?
No, about 1 in 7 convicts was female.
And children, too. I read about that. Some were incredibly young.
Yeah, that's one of the most shocking aspects. Children as young as 9 or 10. There's the famous case of John Hudson, a chimney sweep, transported at 9 for stealing clothes.
9 years old, just mashing.
It's brutal. They face the same journey, the same harsh conditions. Later on, they did set up specific places for young offenders, like Point Pier in Tasmania, sort of early attempts at juvenile reform, but the early years.
Yeah.
Yeah, incredibly harsh.
And it wasn't just thieves and other criminals either. There were political prisoners.
Yes, that's an important group not to forget. Around 3,600 political prisoners were sent over.
Like who?
People like the Scottish martyrs, Irish rebels from various uprisings, English Chartists campaigning for political reform. Think of William Cuffey, a Chartist leader, or Irish nationalists like John Mitchell. Their crime was often their political activity or beliefs.
So transportation was also used to silence dissent. Adds another layer, doesn't it?
Definitely. It complicates the picture beyond just dealing with common crime.
What about escape? Did people try to just run off into the bush?
Oh, all the time. It must have been a constant temptation, despite the dangers. Lots of stories about escape attempts.
Any famous ones?
The standout case has to be William Buckley. Escaped, managed to survive, and ended up living with the Wathaurong Aboriginal people for over 30 years.
30 years. Incredible.
Yeah, when he reemerged, he'd almost forgotten English. He became a really important go-between, a translator, an amazing story of survival and adaptation.
But he was probably the exception, right? Most escapees.
Most didn't make it, sadly. The Australian bush is incredibly harsh if you don't know it. Exposure, starvation, or sometimes violent clashes with Indigenous groups who were defending their own land. It was perilous.
Still, were there any positive interactions early on?
There were some instances, yeah. Records show some convicts traded goods with local Indigenous people, and that actually helped the struggling colony survive in the very early days. Small scale, but significant.
Fascinating how these histories overlap. Let's shift gears slightly. You mentioned geopolitics earlier. How significant was that?
Really significant. You see, Britain wasn't the only European power using transportation. France, Spain, Portugal, Russia. They all do it to some extent, using convicts to claim territory, establish presence, expand influence.
So Australia was part of a bigger global game.
Absolutely. For Britain, setting up the penal colony in New South Wales wasn't just about getting rid of convicts, it was strategic. Stake a claim before France did, secure trade routes in the Pacific and Indian Oceans.
So the convicts were essentially cheap labor for empire building.
In many ways, yes. A controllable workforce to build the infrastructure, roads, bridges, government buildings, exploit resources. Much of early colonial Australia was built on convict labor. Even the foundations of the banking system trace back to that time.
It's quite something to think the foundations of a nation were built by people considered outcasts. How does this compare to, say, slavery?
It's important to make distinctions. Both involved forced migration and exploitation, absolutely. But with convict transportation, the state, the British government, retained responsibility for the convicts. And there was, at least officially, an element of punishment and potential reformation. Slavery was fundamentally about ownership and lifetime exploitation with no pretense of reformation.
Right, and that global significance is why the Australian convict sites are recognized by UNESCO.
Exactly. They're seen as outstanding examples of this whole era of forced migration and colonial expansion using convict labor, a worldwide phenomenon.
Okay, let's talk more about the punishment aspect. How was it designed to work? Was it just about removing criminals from Britain?
It was partly removal, yes, but also very much about deterrence. The idea was that the sheer horror of transportation, the dangerous voyage, the brutal life in the colonies would scare people straight back in Britain.
Make an example of them.
Precisely. The conditions were deliberately harsh. Think flogging, hard labor, solitary confinement. Places like Norfolk Island were intentionally made infamous. A hell on earth to instill fear.
And Port Arthur, too.
Port Arthur had brutal hard labor, the treadmill. Later, they even introduced psychological punishments, the separate system of isolation. And for women in the female factories, like Cascades in Tasmania, punishments could be incredibly degrading. Head shaving was apparently deeply feared.
It sounds incredibly grim, almost purely punitive. Yet, you also mentioned Reformation efforts. How does that fit?
It seems contradictory, doesn't it? But compared to other penal systems of the time, Australia actually saw some quite significant, even innovative attempts at reform. It wasn't just about locking people up and throwing away the key.
What kind of attempts?
Things like structured labor schemes, the assignment system, where convicts worked for settlers, which was exploitation, yes, but also taught skills. There were probation systems, rewards for good behavior, religious instruction was big.
And that mark system.
Yeah, the mark system, famously used by McConaughey on Norfolk Island. Convicts could earn marks for good work and behavior, which counted towards their release. It was quite radical for its time, focused on incentivizing change.
Were there specific governors who pushed for this?
Definitely. Governor Macquarie is well known for his policies supporting emancipists, trying to integrate them back into society. And Alexander McConaughey, with his mark system, they believed, to some extent, in rehabilitation.
So rewards like extra food, better jobs, even land.
Yes, incentives were part of it. Better rations, positions of trust, land grants for some, eventually pardons. They used both the stick and the carrot, you could say. Education and religious teaching were seen as ways to encourage moral reform, too.
Did convicts have any rights at all?
Surprisingly, yes, more than you might think. Compared to, say, slaves or even some free workers back in Britain, they had some legal standing. They could complain about mistreatment by masters, petition the governor. It wasn't equality, obviously, but they weren't entirely without recourse.
And setting up separate places for women and children, that was part of this too.
Yes. The female factories like Parramatta or Cascades and Point Pure for boys were early examples of trying to manage different groups separately, acknowledging, albeit imperfectly, their specific situations. And later, the separate system prisons, influenced by Enlightenment ideas about prisoners needing solitude for reflection. That was part of evolving penal theory.
So this whole massive experiment in Australia, it wasn't static. It changed over time with these competing ideas of punishment and reform.
Exactly. It was constantly evolving. And these debates and practices in Australia actually influenced discussions back in Europe. When transportation eventually ended, Australia served as a major case study for the development of national prison systems.
Like Lieutenant Governor Arthur's open-air panopticon idea in Tasmania.
Yeah, that concept of controlling the whole landscape through surveillance, making convicts feel constantly watched. It reflected those Enlightenment-era ideas about discipline and control, which had a huge impact on prison design and management globally. The Australian experience really left a mark on the history of punishment.
So wrapping up our deep dive for today, it's clear this wasn't a simple story. Transportation to Australia was driven by crime, by geopolitics.
And it involved incredible suffering, but also these unexpected threads of opportunity and attempts at reform. It laid the groundwork for a nation, but in a really complex, often brutal way.
What really stands out for me is just the sheer human scale, all those individuals, the petty thieves, the political prisoners, the children.
Yeah, and the fact that some managed to build new lives against such incredible odds, it really makes you think, doesn't it? About crime, punishment, second chances.
It definitely challenges simple narratives.
Yeah.
And those UNESCO World Heritage Sites, they're powerful reminders, aren't they? Physical links to that past. It makes you wonder, and maybe this is something for you, the listener, to think about. What does this whole story of Australia's convicts really tell us about punishment itself and about the possibility for redemption, within any society? How does knowing this history maybe change how we look at crime and opportunity today?